The dawn of May 19th, 1536 arrived not with golden light, but under a blanket of heavy gray clouds that hung low over the Tower of London. The fortress, centuries old and steeped in both grandeur and grief, loomed quietly over the city like a solemn witness to the tides of power. That morning, its great stone walls did not echo with the usual bustle of courtly life. Instead, a strange hush hung in the air, as if even the stones themselves were holding their breath. A small scaffold had been erected in the courtyard, not the tall ceremonial platform used for public executions, but a more discreet construction. It had been built to suit the style of a swordsman from France, summoned specially for this grim occasion. His weapon was unlike any in England, a long, finely honed blade designed for a single swift motion. Today, history was about to be written with steel and silence. Word had spread through whispers among servants, guards, and members of the court. Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, was to die that day. For the first time in the kingdom's history, a crowned and anointed queen would meet her end by the sword. The woman at the center of it all had once captivated the king so completely that he had torn apart Christendom to possess her. She wasn't merely a romantic obsession. She had been the catalyst of a seismic shift, the force that led Henry VIII to sunder England from the authority of the Pope's severe centuries of Catholic tradition and birth a new church in his own name. For love, or what passed for it, he had changed the very soul of a nation. And now that same woman was pacing the stone floor of her small chamber, dressed for death, her final morning unfolding in quiet dignity. Anne Boleyn was 35 years old. In her final days, though stripped of title and power, she remained a figure of grace and resolve. Her imprisonment in the Tower had lasted just over 2 weeks, 17 days, in which the world she once ruled crumbled around her. But she never allowed despair to break her. On that final morning, a few loyal ladies helped her dress. Each article of clothing was chosen with care, not for fashion, but for symbolism. She wore a dark gray cloak trimmed in fur, solemn and understated, befitting a woman ready to meet her fate with composure. Beneath it, a deep crimson bodice chosen not for vanity, but to conceal the blood that would soon stain the ground. As she dressed, Anne made a remark that would echo through history. "I hear the executioner is very good." "I have a little neck," she said, fingers lightly grazing her throat. Those who heard her would remember the moment as chilling, even witty, a flash of the sharp intellect and boldness that had once enchanted a king and terrified a court. She would die as she had lived, fearless, self-possessed, and unbowed. But how had it come to this? Anne's rise did not begin with royalty, but with ambition, intelligence, and a singular presence. Born to Thomas Boleyn, a shrewd diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, daughter of one of England's noble houses, Anne grew up immersed in politics, court intrigue, and the whispered ambitions of the elite. She was educated abroad, first in the Netherlands and later in France, where she served at the court of Queen Claude. There she absorbed the elegance of Renaissance thought, fluent not only in French and Latin, but in ideas, theological debates, political philosophies, the language of art, beauty, and power. She returned to England around 1522, and what she brought back was not merely culture, it was command. Anne did not conform to the English ideal of beauty. Her skin was darker, her hair raven black, her eyes intense. But where she defied convention, she also defined desire. Her intelligence dazzled, her charisma dominated. In a room full of courtiers, she stood apart not because she spoke the loudest, but because she didn't have to. And it wasn't long before she caught the eye of the most powerful man in England. When King Henry VIII first noticed Anne Boleyn, he was still married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Their marriage had not produced a male heir, and Henry's frustration had begun to ferment into political desperation. His kingdom needed stability. His dynasty needed a son. Anne, unlike many ladies of court, did not submit easily to the king's affections. She had seen what happened to women who surrendered too quickly. Her own sister, Mary Boleyn, had been Henry's mistress, and after she bore him children and was discarded, she became a cautionary tale whispered among the ladies in waiting. Anne would not follow that path. When Henry approached her, she delivered a line that would change the course of history. "If you wish to take my body, your majesty, then you must first put a crown on my head." It was a demand so audacious, so nearly treasonous, that it might have ruined her had Henry not been utterly enthralled. For 7 years, Anne held him at bay. Their relationship smoldered not with submission, but with challenge. She tantalized him with her wit, provoked him with her mind, and refused him with elegance. In return, he became increasingly consumed. But to marry Anne, Henry needed more than persuasion. He needed a divorce from Queen Catherine, and that required the Pope's approval. When Rome refused Henry turned the world upside down. He defied the church. He defied the emperor. He broke with Rome and created a new faith, the Church of England, with himself as its supreme head. It was an act of spiritual rebellion and political genius, and it was all for Anne. In January 1533, Henry and Anne were married in secret. She was already pregnant, and both hoped that the child she carried would be a son, the long-awaited heir. In June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony filled with gold pageantry and the echo of a new era. But in September, she gave birth not to a prince, but to a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed. He needed a male heir, not a girl. Still, for a time, Anne remained secure. She surrounded herself with scholars and reformers. She promoted the English translation of the Bible, challenged papal authority, and believed fervently in the cause she had become a symbol of. She wasn't just a queen, she was a queen with a mission. But she was also a queen with many enemies. The old aristocracy despised her. The Catholic world denounced her. The people once hopeful now whispered that she had brought turmoil to the kingdom. Even in her own household, there were those who smiled by day and conspired by night. Her failure to produce a son began to weigh heavily on her crown. In 1534, she suffered a miscarriage. The following year brought more hope, another pregnancy, but in early 1536, after hearing that Henry had suffered a terrible injury in a jousting accident, she miscarried again. The child, a son, was lost. Anne was devastated. She reportedly believed that her grief and fear had killed the baby. And as the hope for a male heir slipped away, so too did Henry's affections. As Anne's influence waned and her womb failed to deliver the Prince Henry so desperately wanted, the sharks began to circle. At the head of this silent campaign was Thomas Cromwell, once her ally in the fight against Rome, now her calculated enemy. Cromwell had served Henry with ruthless efficiency. He understood the tides of power and how to sail with them. By 1536, he had come to see Anne not as an asset but a threat. She was opinionated, politically ambitious, and wielded influence that often clashed with his own. Worse still, her failure to produce a son had made her vulnerable. Cromwell knew Henry wanted to move on. A new woman, Jane Seymour, had captured the king's eye. Unlike Anne, Jane was soft-spoken, submissive, and held the promise of renewed hope. Cromwell offered a path forward, rid the king of Anne permanently. What followed was a chilling orchestration of downfall. Whispers became allegations. Allegations became charges. One by one, men close to Anne were arrested, musicians, courtiers, even her own brother George Boleyn. The accusations were grotesque: adultery, incest, treason. It was clear to anyone with eyes that the charges were fabricated. The timelines didn't match. The witnesses were unreliable. The evidence was nearly non-existent. But in Tudor England, facts were fragile things. What mattered wasn't what was true, it was what the crown needed to be true. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. She arrived by boat the same way she had once come for her coronation 3 years earlier. But now there were no cheering crowds, no golden robes, only cold water and colder stares. Anne's trial was scheduled for May 15th, just 2 weeks after her arrest. There was no time for a proper defense, and no effort was made to grant her one. She was given no legal counsel, no chance to cross-examine witnesses, and the jury was handpicked to deliver the desired verdict. The charges were read aloud in a somber hall: adultery with 5 men, including her brother, conspiracy to murder the king, and betraying the realm. The accusations were outlandish. Yet Anne stood before the court not as a broken woman, but as a queen, dignified, composed, and articulate. She answered every question with poise, pointing out the flaws and contradictions in the prosecution's case. Her voice did not tremble. Her eyes did not lower. Observers described her as calm, noble, and utterly composed. One remarked, she spoke not like a woman condemned, but like an angel sent to bear witness. But the verdict had already been written in the air before the trial began. Guilty. The sentence: death by burning. Later, in what was described as an act of mercy or a calculated political maneuver, Henry commuted her sentence to beheading. A French executioner renowned for clean, swift kills was sent for. The king wanted it done quickly, quietly, with minimal blood on his hands. Anne returned to her cell in the tower where she waited. Not for hope, there was none, but for time to catch up with fate. The morning of May 19, 1536 arrived quietly, too quietly for an execution. Anne had been told she would die at 8 a.m. p.m., and so she prepared herself early. She dressed, prayed, took communion, and steadied her breath for the final journey. But then the execution was delayed. She waited and waited. Hours dragged by like centuries. Alone in her chamber, Anne murmured her final prayers. "Lord, have mercy on me," she whispered again and again. She swore before God that she had never betrayed the king. "For my salvation, I am innocent of the crimes for which I am condemned." Despite the injustice, she did not rage. She did not beg. Her composure in those moments became legendary. Even the guards and priests attending her were moved not by her sorrow, but by her grace. Then the drums began. Outside, a crowd of roughly 1,000 people had gathered. There were no jeers, no calls for vengeance, only stillness. Even those who had once despised her seemed shaken by the solemnity of the moment. Anne gave her last gifts to her ladies-in-waiting, a prayer book, a ring, a piece of cloth. "Remember me," she said gently, "not as a victim, not even as a queen, but as a woman who lived fully, dared boldly, and faced death without fear." She stepped onto the scaffold. Gray and crimson fabric swept around her feet like dusk and blood. Her posture was perfect, her chin lifted, her back straight. She addressed the crowd. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to denema according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for never prince had a more loving subject than I." She did not name her accusers. She did not protest her sentence. It wasn't weakness, it was choice. She would meet death not with screams, but with sovereignty. A lady stepped forward and tied a blindfold over her eyes. Anne adjusted it herself with a graceful motion, then folded her hands and knelt. The French executioner stood behind her, dressed in black. He had hidden his sword in the straw, as was customary to prevent fear. Then, to distract her, he softly called to his assistant, "Bring me the sword." Anne turned her head just slightly. One clean stroke, no struggle, no scream, only silence. And in that silence, a queen fell. Her body was placed in a crude arrow chest meant for storing weapons, not royalty. No coffin, no ceremony. She was buried within the tower beneath the chapel floor where she had once walked as England's queen. But death did not end her. Anne Boleyn's legacy rose from that cold grave. The daughter she had borne, Elizabeth, would grow into one of the greatest monarchs the world had ever known. A queen who ruled for 45 years, who led England into a golden age, who proved that the blood of Anne Boleyn was not shameful, it was sovereign. Anne had lost her crown, her freedom, her life. But she had never lost her courage. She had lived fiercely, loved dangerously, and believed in her place at the heart of history. She had reached for power in a world that told women to be quiet, and for that she paid the ultimate price. But what a price to leave behind such a legacy. Nearly 5 centuries later, her name is still spoken, not as a warning, but as a torch. Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, martyr, revolution. She was silenced, but never forgotten. She knelt to the sword, but she stood tall in history. Anne didn't settle for being someone's mistress or a background figure in history. She looked a king in the eye and said, "If you want my body, give me a crown." In a world where women were told to stay silent, she asked for power, and she got it. Yes, it cost her everything, but what a bold price to pay for a dream that rewrote a nation. Those who reach for the crown will always walk the edge of a blade, but without them, history never changes. Anne wasn't just beautiful. She was brilliant. She brought reform, challenged the church, and held her own in a world dominated by men. She was feared not because she was weak, but because she was capable. And through her daughter, she left behind a legacy that redefined female power in history. If your mind scares them, don't dim it. Use it.